This video is mainly for beginners, letting you know which are the easiest and most effective heroes to use within Marvel Rivals. There's a lot of options to choose from, but which one should you pick to do the best in this game? Let's put our guides in now, and what we have here is the difficulty at the bottom and the effectiveness up the side. Now, the more in red you are, the more difficult and least effective you are. And the more in green you are, the more easier you are and the most effective you are. So now we're going to start off with our first hero, which is Jeff the Shark. Now, Jeff the Shark at the moment in Season 1 of Marvel Rivals is definitely very easy to use. So his difficulty scale is definitely down here. In terms of his effectiveness scale, I don't think he's as effective as he was in Season 1 or Season 0 for that matter. But he's definitely a good choice, and he's not as good as other healers, but he's definitely an easy choice to use, so I do think he sits in the orange area of effectiveness. Next hero we have is Iron Man, and Iron Man is relatively easy to use. He's not super easy to use because he can fly and it makes it a little bit more difficult to kind of aim where you want to go and things like that. But he's not super hard either, and his effectiveness in Season 0 is pretty solid, so the lower down we go here, the more effective these heroes get, which is really good to see. So having said that, now we basically put Iron Man in a difficulty of this orange section where he is very effective. Next up we have Iron Fist. Now when it comes to Iron Fist's difficulty, he is relatively difficult to use. His kit is not super easy to understand, but also he's a melee hero, which already makes him difficult enough. In terms of his effectiveness though, I don't think he's as effective again as in Season 0. But now he is still a decent choice if you know how to use him correctly, but I think when it comes to beginner heroes, Iron Fist is going to be a relatively tough choice. Next up we have Invisible Woman. Now I've played a lot of time with Invisible Woman. It's probably the highest healer I've used in terms of time played in this game, and I do think she's not super difficult to use. I think she's definitely on the lower end. If you know how to use her kit correctly, you can definitely do well with it. And her effectiveness is absolutely insane, by the way. She's one of the best healers in the game right now. Next up, we have Hela. Now, Hela's not being used too much at the moment, but I do still think she's an absolutely solid choice within Marvel Rivals. She still outputs an absolutely insane amount of damage, and she's never really got that much of a nerf anyway. So I do think in terms of difficulty, she is slightly harder to use than Jeff the Shark, but it's not like she has insane combos or anything like that. So difficulty still in the orange section here, and her effectiveness again is very solid. I do still think she sits in the green. The next hero we have is Hawkeye. Now I think Hawkeye in terms of difficulty is quite hard character to use, especially since he's a one-shot kind of sniper style hero. And that's what makes him difficult to use, and I do think he's on the higher end here for sure. In terms of his effectiveness, it just depends on how well you can do with this hero, but when it comes to starting off in this game, I don't really recommend Hawkeye all that much, if I'm being perfectly honest. So I do think he's quite difficult. I wouldn't say he's the hardest hero in the game, by no means, but his effectiveness rating as well, especially in high rank matches, you don't see a lot of Hawkeyes about. Next up we have Groot. Now I think Groot is probably the most easiest, most effective Vanguard in the game. Now there's a lot of Vanguards in this game and they're all really good, but I think Groot is the easiest one to actually understand how to play this game with. Not only that, he has the highest amount of health as well, which definitely helps. So when it comes to using Groot, any Fortnite player will love this guy, but that's not even what we're talking about here. He's a very easy, and he does really do the job of what a Vanguard is supposed to. Next up we've got Adam Warlock. Now Adam Warlock is not a difficult hero to use by any means. It's actually about the same difficulty as using Hela, more or less. He's also hit scan as well, and if you like using Hela and you want to try a healer, then he's probably one of the easier ones to kind of switch on to, just because of the way his attacks work. But in terms of effectiveness in this game, especially how the strategists are going at the moment, he's not great, to be honest. I think he actually just needs a slight buff, if I'm being perfectly honest with you. So next up we've got Black Panther. Now when it comes to difficulty, he's on the highest end of the scale you could possibly get, to be honest. There's only one other hero that kind of matches that, if I'm being perfectly honest with you. In terms of his effectiveness, it has dropped within Season 1. I don't see a lot more Black Panthers running around than I did in Season 0. But he's definitely still a very effective hero if you know how to use him right, but his difficulty level is up there. Next up we've got Black Widow. Now we all know how I feel about Black Widow. When it comes to effectiveness, probably the worst hero in the game, I'm not going to lie to you. Slightly better, see a lot more Black Widows running around now recently, I don't know why. maybe they're just trying to use the hero because they're a bit better at the game. But in terms of difficulty, she's up here obviously because she's a one-shot hero, so again, that's something to keep in mind as a sniper style character. But difficulty is not as hard as Hawkeye in my opinion. I think she's a bit easier to use. Next up, we've got the Hulk. Now, the Hulk is a very hard hero to use within this game. His effectiveness is absolutely insane. He's probably one of the best dive vanguards, or probably the best dive vanguard in the game at the moment. So in terms of effectiveness, I want to put him in green because he's absolutely solid. But again, he's very difficult to use, similar to Black Panther. Next up, we've got Captain America. Now, definitely a solid choice now when it comes to vanguards, but I do think, again, he's one of the more harder ones to use in this game. Definitely a hard choice in terms of how you need to play him as well, because he's a dive vanguard. His effectiveness is nowhere near as good as the Hulk. Next up's Doctor Strange. Now, in terms of his effectiveness, he's absolutely in the green. Every high ranked player is using this guy. So he's definitely one of the more effective heroes in the game. In terms of his difficulty, I do think he's in the higher end of orange, to be honest. I don't think he's like super hard to use, but I think you just need to learn his timings pretty well. And then once you do that, then he's obviously a really, really effective hero to use. So I do think his effectiveness rating is top tier. Next up, we've got Cloak and Dagger. Now, I play with a lot of low level players and some high level players in ranked matches as well. But everyone who picks up this hero basically does extremely well with them every single time, and I want to put them right next to Invisible Woman when it comes to their effectiveness in terms of healing, which is absolutely insane, and the difficulty level. I'd actually probably say Cloak and Dagger is probably a little bit easier to use than the Invisible Woman. Next up, we have Moon Knight. In terms of his difficulty rating, I don't think he's super hard to use. You just need to learn a couple of his combos, and he's actually up there in terms of effectiveness as well. I think he's definitely one of the more effective DPS in the game. In terms of difficulty, probably not as hard as Doctor Strange to use. Next up, we have Mr. Fantastic. In terms of his difficulty rating, I do think he's very similar to Moon Knight. He's not that hard to use. You just need to learn one or two combos and then you're kind of good. Also, in terms of his effectiveness, he's in the orange. He definitely can be effective in kind of low rank matches. I don't see a lot of Mr. Fantastics in the high level games. Next up, we have Mantis, and Mantis is definitely a relatively easy hero to use. I do think she's in the green section in terms of how easy you can use Mantis and how intuitive her abilities actually are. As long as you're aiming at whoever you want to heal, you can heal them, and then she has a lot of good abilities along with that as well. In terms of her effectiveness, I'm going to put her just slightly better than Jeff. I do think she is slightly a better healer than Jeff, to be honest. Next hero we have is Magneto, and again another one that turns up all the time in high ranked matches every single time. I think his effectiveness, again, probably not as good as Doctor Strange, but he's definitely very close. And when it comes to difficulty, I do think he kind of sits slightly easier than Doctor Strange. Next up, we've got Magic, again a hero that I have not really put too much time into, but I do think in terms of her difficulty, she does sit in the red section here, probably just as difficult as Iron Fist to use. But in terms of effectiveness, she's obviously a solid choice because she turns up in high rank matches all the time as well. And I'd say she's just as effective as Moon Knight, Magneto, Hela as well. Next up, we've got Luna Snow. In terms of effectiveness, I think she's about the same as Mantis, to be perfectly honest with you. So she's going to sit kind of roughly somewhere here in terms of vertically, but horizontally in terms of difficulty, I do think she's slightly harder than Mantis to use. So other than the fact that her ultimate's slightly better, I do think she kind of is the same level, but in terms of difficulty, she sits around about here, in my opinion, about the same as Moon Knight. Her abilities are not complicated to use, but you do need to learn how to chain them together and then also know how to use her ultimate correctly as well. Next up, we have Loki, and again, he's probably one of the harder healers to use. And not that he's actually difficult to start with, it's just that to understand how to use his kit correctly, it takes a little bit of thinking, and that's the main thing with Loki, is that you need to think on how to actually use his kit in the right order, on the right way. His effectiveness is actually really good, to be honest. I'm not gonna lie, he's probably in the green. Next up, we've got Namor, which is my main hero in this game. In terms of his effectiveness, he definitely sits in the orange section, and I don't think he can swing full games. He's not as powerful as these heroes down here, just nowhere near as close. In terms of difficulty, I think he kind of sits in between the kind of orange and red section. I mean, to pick him up and play him, it's relatively easy, to be honest. You don't take too much brain power learning his kit. But the fact that he involves really good aim, I think that's kind of where a lot of people fall down with Namor, because you do need to have good aim. Next up, we've got Penny Parker, and I think when it comes to difficulty, I don't think she's super hard to use. You just need to know how to use her kit correctly. So I'm going to put her kind of in between Loki, Magneto, kind of this area here. Effectiveness, I do think she's relatively effective as well, especially within Season 1. I'm seeing a lot more Penny Parkers around the game, and they're also doing really well. So next up, we have Psylocke. Now, Psylocke's effectiveness is great in this game. Very effective hero, and we're running out of effectiveness space, as you can see here. But I also don't think she's that hard to use, to be honest with you. People put her difficulty a lot higher, but our combos are relatively easy to understand, and I do think she kind of sits under Iron Man in terms of how to use her. Maybe right next to Hela, to be honest, in terms of effectiveness as a DPS. Next up, we've got Rocket. Now, Rocket is super easy to use in this game. One of the easiest healers to pick up and play and understand how this game works. The fact that he's got a gun makes him a lot easier. The fact that he can dash around, his movement's great, makes him a lot easier. Now, to master this character, it does take a little bit of skill, but to even master him, it is not going to take you too long at all. Effectiveness, he definitely sits right next to Jeff. I think Jeff's a slightly better healer, if I'm being honest, so I'm going to put Jeff slightly down here. Rocket goes here in terms of ease of use. Next up, we've got Scarlet Witch. Now, in terms of Scarlet Witch's effectiveness, she's definitely up in the red section. She's not the best, other than her ultimate attack, which is actually really good, but other than that, she does have aimbot, which is kind of useful, but I don't think she's as effective as some of these other heroes, maybe about as effective as Adam Warlock. Difficulty-wise, she's probably about the same difficulty as well, so I'd probably stack these two on top of each other, but I'm just going to put her right here. Next up, we've got Spider-Man. Now, everyone loves this guy, but to be honest, his difficulty in this game is absolutely insane. Probably the hardest hero to use in this entire game, in my personal opinion. Effectiveness-wise, unless you're absolutely insane or cracked with Spider-Man, he's really not that effective either, to be honest. He's definitely more effective than a Black Widow, so I'm going to put him right about here. But I'm going to put him quite high up because to master him and to do well with him at the same time, and especially in high ranks, is almost impossible, and that's why most players end up picking someone else. Next up, we've got Squirrel Girl. Now, Squirrel Girl is actually a pretty solid choice at the moment. In terms of effectiveness, she's pretty good, and that's only after I've seen one of my friends pick up and play them. And in terms of difficulty, she's so easy to use, so to actually do her job as a DPS and output damage, she's actually great in this game, and a lot of the high level players are picking her up now. Next up, we've got Star-Lord. Now, I do think Star-Lord's a very effective DPS in this game. I think he's probably one of the best, actually. When it comes to outputting damage, that is, of course. He definitely sits right about down here somewhere. When it comes to difficulty-wise, I do think he can be slightly more difficult to use than Moon Knight, just because of the way his movement actually works and the kind of ranges you're going to be finding yourself fighting in. Next up, we've got Storm, probably the other flying hero, and I'm going to actually put her next to Iron Man here. I do think she's slightly less effective than Iron Man at the moment, even after the buff. She's pretty decent now. Next up, we have Punisher, and Punisher is a very easy hero to use. Difficulty-wise, very, very low. He's super easy to understand if you've played any game ever that involves a gun and shooting. And his kit is a little bit more complex than just that alone, obviously with his zip lines and stuff, but a lot of it is very intuitive and it makes sense. His effectiveness is actually pretty solid as well. He's actually probably a really good DPS in the game as well, so I don't think he's any less effective than a Hela, to be honest with. Next up, we have Thor, and I think Thor, when it comes to his effectiveness, he definitely sits in the orange section. He's not a super solid Vanguard like Magneto or Doctor Strange or the Hulk, but he's definitely a good choice if you want kind of like a DPS melee Vanguard hybrid. Next up, we have Venom. Now, I do think Venom, when it comes to Season 0, everyone was using him as the main dive Vanguard, but now everyone's using Hulk instead. I do still think Venom's a very solid choice. I think he's slightly easier to use than the Hulk as a dive Vanguard, and I do still think his effectiveness is still there in this game if you want to use him. Next up, we've got Winter Soldier. In terms of difficulty rating, I don't think he's that hard to use whatsoever, but in terms of effectiveness, I think he's probably one of the best DPS in the entire game. And again, I'm going to sit him next to Star-Lord because he's actually amazing within this game. I do think he's a really solid choice because he can do a lot of different things. He can go for tanks, definitely a really good tank buster hero. He can also be range DPS if we need him to be. Lastly, we have Wolverine, and I do think even though he is a melee hero and it might seem he's easy to use to begin with, I don't think he's super hard to use compared to the ones higher up on this list. He's probably just as hard to use as Venom and maybe just as effective as a Venom. I like to stack these two on top of each other, but I can't do that for the sake of this video. So I do think Wolverine's difficulty is basically the same as Venom's, and then again when it comes to his effectiveness it's pretty much the same as well. So there we have it, that is our ratings, and maybe stay away from the heroes that are in this bubble right here. These are going to be the most difficult heroes to use, but also some of the least effective ones, as I said, as we go higher up on the page here. So just keep that in mind, and this is going across the board for high rank games and also the low level games as well. Maybe you might want to stick to these few heroes if you are a beginner, and these are the ones that are going to give you the best output in terms of how you can perform in a game and do well, and also easy to pick up and actually play. Now majority of the heroes will sit in this middle section right here, of course, because with a little bit of skill and a little bit of practice they can be really effective, as you can see here. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe, and thank you very much for watching.